I have and experienced psychosis. This puts me in a unique position to analyze the most important game I've ever played, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. In a media world filled to the brim with psychotic villains, this story is different. For it is the one with psychosis that is the hero. And for that, well, I can't express my gratitude enough. In today's video, I won't really go over the gameplay or the visuals or the music. I will a little bit, but not much. No, friends, rather I will tell you a story, just as Senua does. To this end, there will be full spoilers for the game, but won't be talking about the ending quite yet. We have a lot to cover. Furthermore, and I'm writing this after creating the majority of this video essay, this isn't so much an analysis of the game, but rather includes a comprehensive guide to exactly what psychosis is, what self-disorder is, and my own personal theory of how self-disorder is the root cause of psychosis. Seriously, in this YouTube video, I will be posturing a new theory on the very nature of psychosis, one that I call the expanded consciousness model. Needless to say, I did more research than I've ever done in my life to make sense of my own mental illness. And of course, we'll also be talking rather extensively about the game itself. For another quick disclaimer, this video may not be safe for those who experience psychosis themselves, those who have thought about ending their own lives, or those who have been SA'd. Viewer discretion is, as always, advised. So join me as we go to challenge the darkness itself. Psychosis is a detachment from reality. This can feature things like hallucinations, often auditory in nature, and delusions, which are fixed false beliefs not supported by evidence. There is a strong genetic factor behind psychosis, but it is also believed to be caused by trauma, especially at an early age. An overabundance of dopamine may also play a part, but we'll be getting to all of that later. But you probably already know most of this. And if this seems like an extremely basic explanation, that's because it is. For this video, rather, I will be offering my own personal interpretation, which is a mix of research I myself have done, as well as my own personal experiences. To note before we start, this is all my understanding of the material, so I may naturally be misunderstanding things. Don't use this information to self-diagnose, as I don't claim to be an authority on the topic, for once. But if you do feel like a lot of this applies to you, perhaps you should talk to your doctor or another trained medical professional. Confusion. Have you ever looked at the world, at your own reality, and not understood it at all? That, to me, is one of the foundations of psychosis. Something like schizophrenia, something you are primed to think about when discussing psychosis, is primarily thought to be, well, a thought disorder. Thought disorder has generally been broken down into two distinct parts: content thought disorder, or CTD, and formal thought disorder, or FTD. The first, CTD, involves delusions, and refers to the specific contents of the thoughts one may have. This goes down to the essence of the thought, its soul, if you will. Otherwise known as disorganized thinking, it is a common feature in those with schizophrenia, but can also appear in other forms of psychosis and even those with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Formal thought disorder is a bit more telling, is when no one can physically be in the mind of another, and those with CTD often have a hard time conveying their thoughts due to things like thought blocking, or in my case, having so many different trains of lateral thoughts happening all at once, something that when I expressed in real time probably scared my girlfriend. FTD is more outwardly obvious. This is the structure of thoughts, and if CTD is the soul of the thought, FTD is the body, its very shape. But this can be broken down even more. Formal thought disorders can be categorized as either positive FTD, which is things like talking really fast or pressure of speech, and more obvious things like clanging or stringing words together that make no sense in terms of substance, but rather feature things like rhyming. The other half of this coin is negative FTD, which is otherwise known as poverty of speech, or having your words have little actual substance, or answering with extremely short replies. A quote from Wikipedia: "The amount of speech may be normal but conveys little information because it is vague, empty, stereotyped, over-concrete, over-abstract, or repetitive." Both content thought disorder and formal thought disorder are intrinsically tied together. And while I won't claim that CTD causes FTD, that would be a gross oversimplification, I do think they both consist of the same essence, one being the body and one being the soul. Honestly, psychosis seems to be the byproduct that makes sense of a world that makes zero sense, with thought disorder being the actual physical abnormality in the brain. But we'll be getting more into that later. I think Milk Outside a Bag of Milk Outside a Bag of Milk, the sequel to the equally brilliant Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk, portrays it best. I explained it in this quote when I said, Ending 2. This one confused me, a lot. But then I thought back to the other endings I've experienced this far at the time of writing, namely the first, second, and fourth, and thought about what they all have in common: perspective. It's clear that ending 2 is a closed loop. The girl in the room leads the girl outside and then back to the room, meaning that we are looking at a single person here, but just from two different perspectives. There is the unknown, mysterious entity that does nothing but essentially just make weird noises, and then the normal person observing it. The latter is probably what the girl knows others perceive her as, and in a weird way, the way that she can often perceive herself. During her intense introspection, she may even look at herself as stupid or lesser, just because she doesn't fit societal standards. She may, as we see in the ending, be afraid of herself. It's incredibly sad. And then we have the girl the other is perceiving, the one trapped in the room, screaming for help. And while she clearly lives within a bizarre reality, it's important here that everything makes sense within that bizarre structure. Meaning she has a solid logical understanding of her world, but it's just that her world makes no sense. So to an outsider's point of view, the girl herself simply makes no sense. She's certainly not stupid like we see others believe. This essentially mirrors everything we see in the game, as we are privy to the girl's perspective, both from how others look at her, and how she came to understand her bizarre reality. There are two sides to one girl. In this ending, she runs away from a voice because she's scared. Then she runs towards a voice because she is scared. And that is something we can all relate to and understand, no matter who we are. This may seem contradictory, as I just said the world makes no sense to those with psychosis. But I would say that the girl in Milk 2, as well as Senua and Hellblade, are presented with a nonsensical world, as they have a nonsensical interpretation of reality due to the many nonsensical thoughts that they have. They are presented with nonsensical facts produced by their very own brain, and their mind then has to make sense of it all. The mind remains logical, but the brain is already presenting false information. Think of AI. It currently works by processing information that is fed to it by human people. If you fed it the wrong information, it would come up with a logical conclusion based on the evidence given. But the information was never correct, so the conclusion will also be incorrect. Now, the human brain is much more complicated, but this analogy I just made up makes me sort of understand my own condition better. So, good on me. It seems rather obvious how delusions play a factor in this. When I shake hands with someone random at the bar as they initiate, my mind immediately goes to, they're going to SA me. Now, it's not even necessarily an abnormal thought, as humans are naturally designed to look after themselves and their loved ones. But then when you have a firm, petrifying belief that for days after the fact, they're going to find a way to come to your house and hurt you, you may have a problem. During a therapy session, I found my own interpretation of delusional thinking. We all have unbased ideas, but they are fleeting. We gloss over them rather easily unless we've had past experiences with the nature of that thought. For those with delusional thinking, however, they take the idea to its natural extreme. They think of the worst possible outcome at all times, especially when they're paranoid, and worse yet, they stick to that belief, firmly having faith that it will happen. Honestly, I still think that man is going to come to my house, and it's been almost an entire year. With the help of medication, of course, one can label these thoughts as delusional. But at least in my case, I only do this because I recognize that these thoughts are outside the norm, and that people simply don't believe them. And while that helps distinguish my delusional thoughts from my normal thoughts, I still firmly believe them. The sad reality is, to be candid, that I hardly even have normal thoughts anymore, and my world is full of delusion. To get specific, I believe that inanimate objects are alive. For a great example, here is another excerpt from my Milk 2 analysis. Enjoy. We simply like things more when they look like us. However, some can take this too far. I'm going to show you the script real quick, and you're going to promise not to laugh at me. See all the parentheses? Those are typos that I kept around because I feel bad for them. Because I perceive them to be living, possibly even breathing things. I think to myself, they've been waiting all this time for their chance to contribute. I can't take that away from them, so I keep them around. I do this with basically all inanimate objects, from stuffed animals to literal garbage. This morning, I almost ate an entirely burned to a crisp piece of Impossible sausage because I felt bad for it. In the end, I managed to only have to take one bite, and indeed, it had the consistency of a rock. It was not a pleasant experience. I had to do everything in my power not to take it out of the garbage and eat it after I had thrown it out. And you can tell me they're not real, and I can tell you I know that, but in my own mind, I'm still going to believe they are. I'm still going to believe they are. As will the girl. End quote. While writing this script, I just had to change the word from to for. This caused me great distress, as I can feel the word trembling, scared, crying out for help as I changed it. As I'm writing this very paragraph, I just had to do the exact same thing 5 exact times, and every time is harder than the last. If I had the ability to cry, I think I would every time. This phenomenon extends to other parts of my life as well. I work as a barista, and every time 2 cups get stuck together and I have to separate them, I think 2 things. That 1, they just want to be in love and I'm hurting them by the separation, and 2, that this is a direct sign from the universe that my girlfriend and I will break up. Well, the first has no name, actually it does, we'll be getting to that. The second is a clear delusion of reference, something featured very heavily within Hellblade, but don't worry, we'll also be getting to that in a future section. I want to give another example. In my sophomore year of college, I had a crouton. But this was no ordinary crouton. No, it was my son. And while everyone begged me to throw it out, I instead secretly kept it, storing it in my mini fridge that was under my bed. I then proceeded to keep it in there the entire school year, to which eventually molded and spread into the entire inside of the fridge. I wish I still had the picture of it. I'm just now realizing I ruined a poor defenseless mini fridge, and now that will be haunting me until my deathbed. And at the time, before my medication, I had no idea that this was delusional. Honestly, it seemed like the most normal thing in the world. I didn't realize that anything was even remotely wrong. This is perhaps one of the worst parts of psychosis, and why I cannot stress to you enough how vital and important medication is. Many people don't know they have a problem. It's been reported that a vast number of those with schizophrenia do not realize they even have a problem until they end up in the hospital. I forgot the exact term for it, but hey, I looked it up because I felt it would be left out otherwise and thus would feel bad. Anosognosia. I can pronounce words right. It can be potentially dangerous to go without medication if you have psychosis. So if you feel you may have some of its symptoms, please speak to a trained professional. I cannot stress the importance enough. The mind of a psychotic person is a confused one, and that's why hallucinations or delusions are not just isolated cases. The main description of psychosis is a separation from reality, meaning that when a hallucination, as an example, happens, oftentimes the person will not see it as a hallucination, but as a demon, or God himself talking down a said person. I likened it to dreams. I had a dream last night that my tortoise's shell broke, and while I was terrified, he suddenly turned into a blue cat underneath. And not once did I question it, or wonder where my tortoise was a cat underneath. I completely accepted it at face value without a second thought. This is a lot like psychosis, where delusions or hallucinations seem completely normal. This is why they're so unshakable at times. Alright, I think we've talked about exactly what psychosis is. I hope I was able to give you a very detailed and personal interpretation here that goes past the usual delusions and hallucinations. Now that you have some of this foundational knowledge on the issue, we can finally talk about self-disorder and the game proper. Just kidding, we're talking mostly about self-disorder. I want to talk again about self-disorder. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while, you may have seen my previously referenced milk outside a bag of milk analysis video, in which I postured that the girl experienced obscenity disturbance, essentially another word for self-disorder, and subsequently defined exactly what it is. For this section, I will be using an excerpt from that video, as I think I said it best then, but I will be offering both a lot of new information and theories on the topic in this section, as well as relating it specifically to Senua's experiences in the game, since I think and firmly believe that self-disorder plays a pivotal role in her journey, or more accurately, into the player's journey. And when I say new theories, I'll be presenting an entirely new outlook on psychosis as a whole, so please enjoy. Roll the clip. So what exactly is self-disorder? That's a difficult question to answer since it's a bit abstract. Here, this is exactly what Wikipedia says. You're welcome. A self-disorder, also called obscenity disturbance, is a psychological phenomenon of disruption or diminishing of a person's sense of minimal or basic self-awareness. The sense of minimal self refers to the very basic sense of having experiences that are one's own. It has no properties, unlike the more extended sense of self, the narrative self, which is categorized by the person's reflections on themselves as a person, things they like, their identity, and other aspects that are a result of reflection on oneself. Now let's take a look at a more in-depth explanation of the minimal self. Quote again. The minimal self has been likened to a flame that enlightens its surroundings and thereby itself. Unlike the extended self, which is composed of properties such as the person's identity, this person's narrative, and other aspects that can be gleaned from reflection, the minimal self has no properties, but refers to the mindness, givenness of experience. That the experiences are that of the person having them in that person's stream of consciousness. These experiences that are part of the minimal self are normally tacit, I can't pronounce that word, and implied, requiring no reflection on the part of the person experiencing to know that the experience is theirs. The minimal self cannot be further elaborated, or normally one cannot grasp it upon reflection. The minimal self goes hand in hand with immersion in the shared social world, such that the world is always pre-given, i.e. tacitly, again, grasped as self-evident background of all experiencing and meaning. This is the self-world structure. Continuing with the quote. D. Warren gives an example of the minimal self combined with immersion in the shared social world. When looking at this tree in my backyard, my consciousness is directed towards the tree and not towards my own active perception. I am, however, aware of myself as perceiving this tree, yet this self-awareness or self-consciousness is not self-thematic. The focus is normally on the tree itself and not on the person's own act of seeing the tree. To know that one is seeing the tree does not require an act of reflection. Oh boy, that was a lot. Here's a quote from another article that explains the minimal self, Varieties of Self-Disorder, a Biopheno-Social Model of Schizophrenia by Louis Sass, Juan P. Bordo, and Barnaby Nelson, which is grounded in the lived body and inner time consciousness, is experienced not as an entity in one's field of awareness, but as the unseen point of origin for experience, thought, and action, as a medium of awareness, source of activity, or general directedness towards the world. It grounds the first-person giveness or for me-ness of subjective life. Now, when a disturbance occurs in this minimal self, this is what a self-disorder is. If I had to best describe it, I'd compare it to depersonalization, where one may feel out of body. Self-disorder, then, is the feeling or seeming knowingness that one does not even possess a body, or that they perhaps don't even exist. This can often manifest in ways like my example in this cold open of the video, literally having a different POV or not even just feeling like a robot, but rather a blank entity controlled by, and this is vital, an external component. To take another example from Wikipedia, these involve the person feeling as if they lack an identity, as if they're not really existing, that the sense of their experience as being their own, the mindness of their experiential world is failing or diminishing, as if their inner experiences are no longer private and that they don't really understand the world. Here's another example from my own experiences. I like small spaces a lot. That's a bit odd, sure, but not entirely unusual. However, I've always taken it a step further. I used to not even just imagine myself becoming an ant, but actually shift my perspective, my POV, to become one, and then crawl into this space. It was always very relaxing. Of course, one cannot actually shrink themselves down, but reality is not something to be clearly seen, but actually just perceived. And since many with the self-disorder eventually develop psychosis, more on that in a bit, which is itself a perceptual break from reality, then it's not hard to imagine a person can shift their perspective like this, especially since life is just a memory. Watch this video here afterwards for an explanation on that one. My memory of these events, and there are a lot, are from an ant's point of view, literally, and that stems from the fact that my consciousness hardly resides in my body at all. Hell, I can't even look in the mirror for longer than a second without heavily disassociating, and I cannot remember the last time, if ever, I related to that thing staring back at me. The girl in Milk Outside a Bag of Milk Outside a Bag of Milk experiences something similar, with her reflection being an it rather than herself. You can imagine how absolutely horrifying and horrible this feeling is. Externalized consciousness is something we'll be talking about in the next section, however. I hope I've made the distinction between a self-disorder and depersonalization and derealization clear. The latter two just simply don't account for the basic levels of identity disturbance that a self-disorder does. When you have depersonalization, you still retain a core that your being itself will always gravitate towards, even if that pull isn't as strong as it should be. With a self-disorder, however, that core is entirely and utterly missing, relegating your usual thoughts to just kind of float around, leading to a thought disorder amongst many, many other things. Quote again, similar phenomena can occur in other conditions such as bipolar disorders and depersonalization disorder, but SAS's 2014 review of the literature comparing accounts of self-experience in various mental disorders shows that serious self-other confusion and severe erosion of minimal self-experience can only occur in schizophrenia. As an example of the latter, SAS cites the autobiographical account of Ellen Sachs, who has schizophrenia, of her experience of disorganization in which she felt that thoughts, perceptions, sensations, and even the passage of time became incoherent, and that she no longer had the solid center from which one experiences reality, which occurred when she was 7 or 8 years old. This disturbance tends to fluctuate over time based on emotions and motivation, accounting for the phenomenon of dialapsis in schizophrenia, where neurocognitive performance tends to be inconsistent over time. Yes, now it's time to tackle the big word here and make a conclusion: schizophrenia. First, a few disclaimers. Self-disorder is not, according to the International Classification of Diseases, or ICD, or even the United States' Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, part of the schizophrenic experience. It is, however, a concept found in all foundational texts on the illness, including the one who named the disease itself, Eugene Buehler. Furthermore, there is a proposal to include self-disorder in ICD-11. 2. I do not have schizophrenia. Well, I'm not diagnosed with it anyways. I've been working to figure out exactly what's going on up there, so I can't speak for anyone else's experiences. I certainly can't diagnose anyone with anything, even if it's just a fictional character. 3. That being said, however, we are going to work under the assumption that the girl most likely suffers from some kind of schizophrenia spectrum disorder, most likely even schizophrenia itself. It's irresponsible to diagnose others, but I believe it's equally as irresponsible to deny clear evidence and then assume it's something that it most certainly isn't, like saying the girl just suffers from anxiety. This rule only applies to fictional characters though. Never diagnose anyone of anything unless you're a professional, even including self-diagnosis. It's just a misunderstanding at that point, and potentially a harmful one. Furthermore, when I'm choosing to discuss in this video how I'm choosing to analyze Milk Outside a Bag of Milk Outside a Bag of Milk within the context of self-disorder, pretty much means we have to make the generalized assumption that the girl is either schizophrenic or schizoaffective, or at the very least, like bare minimum here, possibly schizotypal. That's just the nature of my style of analysis. 4. This obviously says nothing about the creator or those involved with the project. This is just a fictional story after all. With these disclaimers out of the way, however, let's just see exactly how this all affects the girl and finally discuss the game itself. End quote. Discuss the girl we shall, except this time it will be Senua, kind of. There seems to be, in my estimations, a problem with the psychiatric literature here. Namely that self-disorder, a historically foundational part of the schizophrenic experience, is isolated to just schizophrenia. Well, to be more accurate, it is now believed that schizophrenia exists on a spectrum, with conditions like schizotypal personality disorder, basically the diet or light version of schizophrenia, God, I'm gonna get canceled for saying that. Schizoid personality disorder, a condition that essentially makes you want to avoid connection with others. Schizoaffective disorder, which is more or less schizophrenia combined with a mood disorder like bipolar, major depressive. Schizophreniform, which is schizophrenia but isn't chronic and lasts for less than 6 months. And brief delusional disorder, which lasts about a month. This all encompasses schizophrenia spectrum disorder, or SSD. But this does not all encompass psychosis. I don't have schizophrenia. Rather, I'm officially diagnosed with major depressive disorder with psychotic features. And while I have major doubts as to the diagnosis for myself, that's not really the point. It undeniably exists in our current psychiatric understanding. This is a psychotic disorder, but one that does not fall under SSD. And this is very interesting, since if it is to be postulated that self-disorder is at least one of the root causes of psychosis, which I am unequivocally claiming here, but that absurdity disturbance is only found in patients with schizophrenia spectrum disorder, then, well, you see the problem here. It simply doesn't account for conditions like my own, conditions that undeniably fall under psychosis. Now, I could simply be interpreting the literature wrong here, I'm not a professional after all, but I can't, in my research, find any connection with self-disorder and a psychotic mood disorder, aside from the obvious schizoaffective disorder, which again, falls under the schizophrenia spectrum umbrella. I've even seen claims that dissociation with bipolar disorder specifically is not on the same foundational level of self-disorder, so what gives? But first, let's sort out why I personally believe self-disorder is one of, if not the, theoretical root cause of psychosis. We're going to use schizophrenia as the main example here since it most applies to self-disorder. Schizophrenia is said to have 3 major causes, although I will state outright that we don't know so much about this incredibly complex disease. Furthermore, these causes can all be stringed together, so we'll go in order. Biological factors are strongly tied to the onset of schizophrenia. Genetics are believed to play a major part, with your likelihood for developing a disorder increasing drastically if a close family member has it. This is rather typical of many different mental illnesses, so no surprises here. What seems to be rather specific to schizophrenia, though, is the connection between paternal age and the disease. Basically, the older your father is when you are born, the more likely you are to develop schizophrenia, at least according to the research. Childhood trauma is a basis for so many different disorders, and can naturally cause severe dissociation. But does it connect with schizophrenia? Well, that's complicated. Current evidence does suggest this, but their methodologies have been called out as flawed in many of the papers I've read. So this one remains somewhat of a mystery until more vast research has been conducted. For my interpretation though, I've always felt off, in a psychotic kind of way, particularly with self-disorder itself, long before I had any trauma inflicted upon me in my childhood years. My theory then, based on literally no empirical data, is that those with schizophrenia are born predisposed to it, and that stress and trauma may trigger that predisposition into full-blown onset. But in other cases, onset can simply just occur naturally. As we said, dissociation is extremely common with trauma and trauma-based disorders like PTSD and complex PTSD. And since technically speaking, self-disorder is a type of dissociation, then it would stand to reason that trauma can cause psychosis. Carl Jung's psychiatric approach postures that trauma is the cause for psychosis, and that the separation from reality is oftentimes a coping mechanism made by a child who feels unsafe in their environment. So take that with what you will. We'll be getting more into that in a future section though. This gets to what is presumably the root cause of schizophrenia and psychosis as a whole: chemical imbalance. We hear about it all the time, that a chemical imbalance is what causes things like depression, with it being a deficit of serotonin. And while the current literature suggests this may not actually be the case, it's still a solid theory. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is thought to be caused by, to put it simply, an overproduction of dopamine, with the role of antipsychotics being to block dopamine receptors and limit the amount of it as a whole. This chemical imbalance would then, of course, be caused by the proposed genetic predisposition and childhood trauma. Seems simple enough. But what if we were to take this all into account and then posture that an overabundance of dopamine causes self-disorder? Now, I'm no neuroscientist here, but I would make a lot of the more peculiar symptoms of psychosis make much more sense. We'll be going over this and then trying to justify it with the current neuroscience. As we discussed, self-disorder is the loss at the very foundation of a person. In my own experiences, this has come even in the form of having my memories be from an out-of-body third-person perspective. Literally a bird's eye viewpoint. Self-disorder is where the body and its experiences become not even just inconsequential, but fail to even really exist in the first place. In a way, you do not exist, but are rather just random thought trains happening all at once, both because you have a thought disorder and because you have no true body to call your own. This can lead to a lot of things, but expanded consciousness can perhaps be the most alarming. This is my own half theory, a game theory, if you would. And it essentially is when you identify more with the objects around you in your own environment than your body. I say half theory because I may have seen this theory postured somewhere else, but I completely forgot. Whoops. Your mind as an experiential field of awareness becomes intrinsically tied to your external surroundings. So much so that you can physically feel present 10 feet away from yourself as if you were actually standing there. I did this in a Target parking lot once. Little voiceover note here. Most of the foundational texts on self-disorder do mention this expanded consciousness, not really in that name, but more so in the concept of it, so take that, with what you will. I think I said it best in my own film, America Dreamin', so I'll read that small section of the script for you now. It's funny how the world works. Objects, my environment, they bend to my will. How my thoughts influence everything around me. Yes, and yet I'm alone here. And yet I'm not. They all talk to me. Everything. Everyone. They're my best friends, and yet I can feel it. My soul being stretched, pulled. I can feel it clearly. A part of me is left in every part of this way, from the blades of grass to the cement paved over. But it hurts, makes me anxious. I want to protect myself, but how do I do that when I left exactly 0.25% of me at the grocery store last week? How am I supposed to know that someone isn't messing with my soul? And scene. This feeling of leaving your essence behind, as well as the general concept of expanding consciousness, actually can conceptualize and perhaps even outright explain a lot of the common positive symptoms of schizophrenia, namely many of the delusions and hallucinations. Let's go down the list here. Delusions of reference are an easy one. If you feel like your identity is tied to your surroundings, then it makes sense that you would find special, personalized meaning in them. Those messages are made specifically for you because you are the environment. Next. Most paranoid delusions, a staple of many cases of schizophrenia out there, are also explained through expanded consciousness in much the same way. Your body has no border, no endpoint, so you feel as if every part of your soul is out there for free. It's like constantly having bugs inside of your skin. You'd be quite paranoid of what they might want to do to you inside of there, wouldn't you? Delusions of grandeur, like delusions of reference, are actually quite simple within this context. You become the world, meaning that you are naturally the most important person in it. If you feel omnipresent on a subconscious level, and you are aware of religions like Christianity, then it makes sense you would feel as though you were God, since he is also omnipresent. This brings up an important point. While we can try to identify the underlying thought processes behind a delusion, they're just that, underlying. That's why I said subconscious earlier. Since the delusional person, they are unaware of these underlying thoughts, instead are only cognizant of the actual conclusion delusion, see what I did there, itself. Magical thinking can also be explained with self-disorder and expanded consciousness. If I believe I can read someone's mind, it is because I subconsciously know they're in my area of awareness. Naturally, then, if I telepathically want to communicate my thoughts to said person, it shouldn't be an issue or a problem, since we both share a physical body and thus both share a brain. Do you see how the surface level thought process makes sense here? Clairvoyance is even more obvious. Now for the big one. Take a breath, Alex. Delusional companion syndrome. Upon my research, this is apparently a thing, which, while is kinda reassuring, since I didn't know anyone else experienced this, but, well, it's also basically reported in patients with Alzheimer's, other major neurocognitive disorders, or serious brain trauma. In fact, there are reportedly no known cases of this being a symptom of a psychotic disorder. And since I already believe I have dementia, this surely isn't helping my case. Ouch. But lucky for me, I guess, Curious.com and Sabrina Goldstein have claimed to have a case of someone with delusional companion syndrome and also have schizophrenia. So go me. If you want to read the article, I'll post it in the description, but this is basically as I've described it. Believing inanimate objects are alive. This includes things like stuffed animals to words on a page. This, by far and without a doubt, is my strongest and most persistent delusion, and the one that caused me the most pain. But I will try and explain it with self-disorder. Perhaps it is that an expanding consciousness has caused me to view other objects as being part of my consciousness. And since I am conscious, then that would mean those other things are also conscious. There, I did it. That's the best explanation you're gonna get. And see, herein lies the problem. I can go so far as to explain to you what I believe to be the inner machinations of my own delusion, and yet I still wholeheartedly believe them. I don't even recognize my own explanation to be logical. I don't even view that statement I just said about my explanation to be logical. Even with the help of medications, I believe in all of my delusions, such as delusions of reference, even while I sit here and try to explain them away. Although, voiceover note here, that medication does help a lot in distinguishing normal thoughts from delusion, which is why medication is so important. And I don't really believe all of my past delusions, just a lot of them. So, yeah. It makes very little sense, but as I explained, I'm simply choosing the option that makes much more sense to my own mind. That these objects are alive, that the radio is simply talking to me, that guy from the bar is going to follow me home. That, my friends, has made me unbearably miserable. Hallucinations are a bit harder to pin down. If we were to look at the expanded consciousness model and try to form fit it in, because, let's be honest, this video has data biases all over the place, we would come to some rather half-baked conclusions. Maybe I'm just putting myself down too much though. I've only heard voices outside of my head on 2 occasions. The first, and the one we will be using as an example here, being my girlfriend calling my name down the hallway. She was not home at the time. To my knowledge, auditory hallucinations occur as voices heard outside of the ears, as if someone were simply talking to you. Proximity, of course, differs, but I believe it remains constant that they are external voices and whispers. Expanded consciousness theory accounts for this, as at the end of the day, these are thoughts we are hearing, which may take on an accusatory and harmful tone, or just generally being confusing because of the thought disorder. And since these are thoughts, and since your mind is used to having your body encompass your surroundings, it makes sense that you would hear your thoughts be external to your actual skull. This, of course, results in you hearing your thoughts in the form of external voices. This is easily the most common hallucination, but doesn't account for all of them. Visual, like audio, can also be recontextualized under the expanded consciousness lens. These are still thoughts, but they are just visual in nature. Have you ever thought of something like the color red, perhaps, and almost just kinda see it in your head? That is this principle, conceptualized in an external form. It's that thought, but since your thoughts are external to yourself, your brain fires off a signal that it's seeing something. Your thoughts and environment are all part of the same experiential field of awareness. I think you get the point here. It can apply self-disorder to any number of different hallucinations. I most often hallucinate it raining while inside the house, like I can feel the raindrops on my skin. This too could be explained with external thought, I think. Now I want to ask you a bit of a theoretical question. What is happiness? Leave your comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I ask this because I now want to talk about the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and how perhaps psychosis, and more particularly self-disorder, can actually account for them as well. From discussions I've had with my therapist, I've personally determined that happiness is a very abstract concept. It's complex as something like sadness is, but that its roots are with bodily emotions such as joy or distress. These are physical and hormonal responses our body gives off in order to move the mind in the right direction. Like feeling pleasure while eating candy. Sugar was scarce in the wild, so it's natural to assume that the body will reward itself when consuming it, making the gatherer get as much of it as they can. Of course, in a modern context where sugar is so readily available, well, our brains haven't exactly caught up. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia are those that are a deficit of what should normally be there, like proper facial expressions. Positive symptoms, then, are things added on to the lived experience, like hallucinations and delusions, as we previously discussed. That is an important distinction to make, as we will now be talking about the negative side of things. Anhedonia is a deficit of feeling pleasure, where things that used to make you feel joy no longer do. It affects primarily the physical sensation of the body, which naturally impacts one's ability to feel happiness. While it's very common among schizophrenics, it's also closely tied to depression, and is thought to be caused by overactivity in the prefrontal cortex, specifically in regards to dopamine receptors. This brings up an interesting comparison with depression and schizophrenia, and maybe why psychosis can often spawn from severe depression, like my case. As we discussed earlier, dopamine overactivity is thought to be the main chemical component behind schizophrenia. And if we also see early data suggest that a main component of depression is also caused by the same thing, well, you can put the pieces together. They may not be as dissimilar as previously thought. But we are here to talk about self-disorder. Since pleasure is a physical thing, if the mind believes itself to be intrinsically detached from the physical husk we call a body, then the brain may not respond normally to stimuli. But this brings up an interesting issue, namely that this would mean anhedonia would be present long before the onset of actual psychosis. While I can personally back some of my own experiences to be true, we simply don't have enough empirical evidence to support this claim. Instead, I postured this conclusion. Self-disorder is a progressive phenomenon, meaning it gets worse over time, eventually leading to the onset of full-blown psychosis. But we'll be getting a lot more in depth about that later in this section. Nevertheless, I feel it's rather obvious how being detached from your physical self would have drastic effects in your ability to feel physical, hormonal emotions. Let's then move on to flat affect, which I see as a partner in crime with anhedonia. This is where a person cannot express how they feel outwardly. They can very well still feel that emotion, or they may not. But it seems clear that self-disorder accounts for this as well, even more obviously than with anhedonia, as feeling separated from the body means not using said sac-a-me to express what the mind is actually feeling. These are the two main negative symptoms of schizophrenia that I wanted to discuss, as they are the ones that most pertain to self-disorder. The rest, honestly, can probably be chalked up to a poor motivational operating system due to a dopamine imbalance, as well as thought trains that lead to social isolation. It's also important to note that negative symptoms can further be broken down into two subsets. Primary, where it is a direct symptom of schizophrenia like the ones we discussed, and secondary, which are a byproduct of having the disease like the previously mentioned social isolation. What I'm mainly discussing here are the primary negative symptoms. So, my claim here is that self-disorder is the root cause of psychosis, but that disorders like major depressive disorder with psychotic features and bipolar disorder with psychotic features aren't represented in the current literature. However, there lies more problems with my theory, namely that self-disorder is presumably developed since childhood, but this doesn't exactly line up even with every disorder in the schizophrenic spectrum. Schizophreniform lasts less than 6 months, and brief psychotic disorder lasts even shorter, with less than 1 month. If we were to believe the psychosis is seen in schizophrenia is caused by a severely prolonged exposure to self-disorder, yeah, that kind of rhymed, and that psychosis is simply the mind trying to make sense of this bizarre reality and expanding consciousness, then we would also have to assume the disorders that aren't formally associated with obscenity disturbance are also secretly caused by it. And honestly, we can do that. The assumption isn't really that far off. Clinical depression and bipolar are seen as lifelong incurable diseases. And since the symptoms of self-disorder supposedly don't just go away, then that timeline matches up. We could take an educated guess then that self-disorder could still be the cause of the psychotic portions of those disorders, but just in an albeit poorly defined lesser form. I'll have to do more research on this, of course. Mood disorders, if we believe in the chemical imbalance route, are caused by fluctuations in levels of serotonin and noradrenaline. Major depressive and bipolar obviously fall under this umbrella of mood disorders. The current neuroscience would suggest then that a patient could experience high levels of dopamine causing psychosis while also having low levels of serotonin, i.e. my own diagnosis of MDD with psychotic features. So the two don't exactly overlap and cancel each other out, which I guess is good? At least good for our study here. Well, it would be, except we have to account for the dopamine theory when it comes to bipolar disorder. But I also have no prior knowledge to how brain chemicals work, and since they're just signals in the brain, I suppose they can overlap. If we are to believe in the dopamine theory for bipolar disorder. I mean, psychotic features do present themselves in these mood disorders, so it's undeniably a real thing, so maybe this section was kind of pointless. We of course must also account for borderline personality disorder, which can oftentimes also result in psychosis. BPD is thought to be related to the physical form of the brain itself, as opposed to a problem with neurotransmitters. But I've also seen articles claim that BPD can be caused by fluctuating serotonin levels, so the neuroscience here is far from conclusive. It's also speculated that dopamine levels can be a factor in the development of BPD, so if we are to say that dopamine is responsible for self-disorder, I suppose we would actually want them to overlap, further making this section useless. I won't take it out, of course, because then I would feel bad for it. Ouch. This means that if we hypothesize that high dopamine levels cause self-disorder, for whatever the reason may be for that, which we'll be getting into, then we could still have mood disorders present. Meaning, of course, that self-disorder could be present and the direct cause of psychosis in said mood disorders. Of course, in these disorders, psychosis only presents itself when one is feeling a certain mood. I'm only supposed to feel the effects of psychosis when I'm feeling depressed, and that distinction is important, since if that weren't the case and I was always psychotic when not even being depressed, it would be more like schizophrenia or schizoaffective than anything else. Hence why I don't necessarily believe my current diagnosis, but that's besides the point. This is yet another flaw in my theory. A self-disorder would dictate that psychosis shouldn't depend on a mood, but again, we would just have to assume that self-disorder is a multifaceted phenomenon with different levels of engagement, and that mood disorders' psychotic features have a lesser form of obscenity disturbance, at least for now. These are lifelong diseases, meaning parts of them can be caused by lifelong self-disorder. But the current data simply doesn't show a prevalence in patients with these psychotic mood disorders while also experiencing self-disorder. Perhaps I'll have to take the mantle and do that research myself. Furthermore, this still doesn't account for schizophreniform or brief psychotic disorder, which really do just come out of seemingly nowhere and are seemingly curable. Like they just end. Complete remission. And I've heard no reported cases that have experienced self-disorder. However, these patients always have the possibility of relapsing, so we may want to look at these conditions not as a one-time and done situation, and more as a chronic disease that may just never flare up again. This change in diagnostics leaves open the door for the possibility of self-disorder being the root cause, but again, we have no evidence that this is actually the case. But, of course, more problems arise. Psychosis can be seen in Parkinson's disease as well as dementia and Alzheimer's, both being degenerative disorders of the central nervous system and brain respectively. This is interesting when comparing it to borderline personality disorder specifically, as we previously discussed, mainly thought to be caused by a brain structure problem. So is psychosis not due to dopamine? Well, two possibilities emerge. That the statement I just made is indeed true, well, we don't like that answer, or more likely that psychosis is a neurological disorder, and that it interferes with neuron pathways in specific regards that don't mean due to brain structure. And the science seems to back this up, at least in regards to Alzheimer's disease. Here's a quote explaining this phenomenon from Alessandro Mortorana and Giacomo Gock's article, Is Dopamine Involved in Alzheimer's Disease? It needs to be a lot of words I can't pronounce here. Let's buckle in. It is thought that the altered metabolism of certain membrane proteins may lead to the production of amyloid oligomers that are characterized by a highly toxic effect on neurotransmission pathways, such as those mediated by acetylcholine. The interactions of AB oligomers with these neurotransmitter systems would in turn induce cell dysfunction, neurotransmitter signaling imbalance, and finally lead to the appearance of neurological signs. In this perspective, it is still debated how and if these mechanisms may also engage the dopaminergic system in AD. Recent experimental work revealed that the dopaminergic system may very well be involved in the occurrence of cognitive decline, often being predicative of rapidly progressive forms of AD. There, we made it through it. This theory would indicate an innate connection with schizophrenia spectrum disorders, mood disorder psychotic features, borderline personality disorder, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and I'm sure a whole slew of other neurodegenerative disorders. That brain structure defects directly correlate to the imbalance of chemicals in the neural pathways of the brain, which, well, I guess seems kind of obvious now that I'm typing it out. And while this ties psychotic disorders into a tight little bow and allows for both chemical theory and structure theory, it doesn't really answer my main question. What about self-disorder? Does something like Parkinson's disease really account for it? Well, apparently, yes. To sum up, there are theorized to be two kinds of emotions. Let's call them basic emotions and complex emotions. The former is things like joy or pain. The latter, officially called SCEs or self-conscious emotions, are things like shame or guilt. These are formed by, as the name suggests, reflections upon oneself. In patients with Parkinson's disease, they were seen to have a warped perception of themselves. According to the article, autonomic factors do not underlie the elevated self-disgust levels in Parkinson's disease by, dear Lord, Vasilia Aristodulua, Marina Satali, Paul G. Overton, Anna B. Vivas. That's a lot of names I have no idea how to pronounce. It's like Skidamarie. A disturbance in the self that would naturally lead to a disturbance in SCEs. But is that truly a disturbance in the minimal self, or otherwise known as the embodied self? Self-disorder essentially dictates it must be, but with patients with dementia, for an example, much of the embodied self still remains, such as nonverbal gestures and artistic endeavors, as seen in the 7 Selves of Dementia by Iris Beaumakar, Elodie Bertrand, Robin G. Morris, and Daniel C. Bow-Grubby. So it's really hard to say. This is all getting quite confusing. A major problem we encounter when discussing dementia and Parkinson's with regards to self-disorder is that I posture that obscenity disturbance is a formative age kind of disorder. Does this mean you are born with the guarantee of getting it if you have a self-disorder? Well, not necessarily. Let's talk about memories. This is where it all comes full circle. First, we need to discuss just what exactly is a memory and how you entirely live within them. I think I said it best in my video about the cosmic horror of Lilypads. Yes, that's a real video I made. So buckle up because this is kind of a long excerpt, but I promise it's important. Reality is a fickle thing. Our own perception of it, our own reality, you could put it, is entirely different from any real physical world. While the color red does scientifically exist as a number, those numbers are simply a perception of the natural world, our attempt to quantify it. And even our eyes' interpretation of the color red cannot be said to be the same across different people. It's been proven time and time again that our brains do not perceive the world on a one-to-one basis, and often take shortcuts to make living in it much easier. Imagine driving to work. You're 43 years old, and at this point, you've been making this commute for 20 years now. It's habitual. So I guarantee you that you did not remember this individual drive. When you're in that car now for years even, your mind has been elsewhere. In your own reality, you weren't really driving that car, as our perception is almost entirely derived from our memory. If you don't remember the drive, it, from your point of view, didn't really happen. But of course it did, that's undeniable. But within your mind's eye, which is the only thing that can really form your own reality, it didn't. And you can argue that consciousness is not entirely tied to memory. Thus, even if you don't remember something, your mind, not just your brain, did process it. You were alive in that car. And I see your point here, but I disagree. We live entirely within memories. We exist as a concept in the memories of others, but even more than that, our entire reality that we, our minds experience, is remembered, not lived. If a ball is thrown at you, you'll probably catch it. But there is a specific point in time when the ball is thrown, a nanosecond in the natural world. That is undeniable. However, your brain's computing power is not instantaneous. It will take at least a few milliseconds before your brain can process the information hurling at you. So the time that the ball is thrown at you, and the time that you perceived a ball to be thrown, is entirely not the same. Thus, your brain's awareness is fundamentally not in line with the flow of actual reality, instead having to create a plane of perceived reality. But the only way we can form that plane is with not just the power of the brain, but of the mind, which I believe to be inherently different, but fully explaining that would be a whole book in and of itself. Don't worry, I'm working on it. This is where the situation becomes even more dire. Because while the brain can process and make the body react within a few milliseconds at the minimum by catching the ball, the mind is twice as slow, if not longer. Just because your body reacts doesn't mean your mind is aware of it yet. This is what we call muscle memory, or in first-time cases, a fight-or-flight reaction. Let's go back to our example. The ball is thrown, your brain computes that. It's purely mechanical. The brain will send signals to your muscles to do the task of catching the ball. But the mind is a bit more abstract than that. Once past the emergency response, it becomes unclear what it means for something to actually be thrown. It's technically an abstract concept. This kind of processing power, the ability to fully understand things, is derived from the brain's ability to cross-examine memories and past experiences, using clues in your own learned history to determine what exactly is happening. For the extremely short version, this is what we'll call the mind for now. Of course, one could imagine this process would take a bit longer than it would take for the ball to hit your glove. But you also have to take into account that before any rock-solid conclusion can be made about what's happening, the mind would like a bit more confirmation. That would come in the form of signals coming from your hand's nervous system, more specifically its pain receptors, and traveling up to your brain, confirming that the ball has hit your hand and that what was happening was indeed a ball being thrown at you. Finally, your mind can then process that new information and come to its definite conclusion. At this, you have now come to understand within your own reality that a ball was thrown in your direction. Good job. While this process, ironically enough, involves so much quick thinking that we can't even think about it, it's undeniable that there is a significant delay in your perceived reality's time versus actual reality's time. Even if you've caught that same ball a million times already, there will still always be a delay. And since a memory is a record of something that once happened, you cannot be said to live within anything but a memory of the past, even if to you, you perceive it as happening in the moment. Which I suppose from your perspective that isn't really a memory, but that just further proves how warped your own reality is. So disconnected and delayed from what's actually happening in the real world. Furthermore, it may not technically be registered as a memory within your brain, as it's sort of happening in real time, but then the mind would almost serve as a memory storage database for the experiences your brain has, which then only get fully contextualized within the mind. But by that time, the brain's initial reactionary awareness has already kind of moved on. So I don't know if you can call what is left for the mind to process anything but a memory. Now, I'd have to think about this a lot more before I made a definite conclusion on this, but in some way you can kind of say that the process of analyzing these memories is what the mind is, but I'll give a more solidified answer to that in the future. Thus, that's where we ultimately reside, though. This isn't even to point out how a moment in time is the most incalculable thing in existence, and that it is almost impossible to determine what is a memory and what isn't. But I think we'll save that for a discussion on the second greatest anime ever made, Steins Gate. So, in conclusion, you are a ghost. End quote. I think you get my point here. Essentially, your lived perceptual experience is that of a memory. So then, how does dopamine affect memory? Memory defects have long been reported in disorders like schizophrenia and Parkinson's, two that we extensively tied to dopamine. However, while dopamine is also heavily linked to our memory process, that is mostly observed through working memory, which is sort of like short-term memory, except the latter is simply short-term storage, while working memory contains the manipulation of that data. To my estimation, short-term memory seems to be the base and foundation of working memory, but just that the latter can break that memory down into relevant and irrelevant information. Now, working memory is also tied to long-term memory in some prominent models, so for the sake of this video, we will see that working memory is a feature of both short-term and long-term memory. Good? Good. Think of it this way. You have a memory, and working memory simply brings it to the forefront when its use is needed. At least that is my understanding of it. While schizophrenia and Parkinson's are tied into memory, these memory defects can't simply be limited to retrieval-specific dopaminergic effects. They are a core loss in memory function. In one study, dopamine is a double-edged sword. Dopaminergic modulation enhances memory retrieval performance but impairs metacognition by, here we go again, Mariki Klaus, Nicole Benzik, and Tobias Sommer. That wasn't too bad. They found that dopamine can have a devastating effect on metacognition, which is closely related to metamemory. These are both as defined by, wow, these names just keep getting harder, metamemory, metacognition strategies for improved memory operations in the role of VR in mobiles by Athanasios Dragas, Ilana Metsia, and Charlobos Skiansnes. Here's the quote. Metamemory can be defined as the awareness and control people have over their memory operations. Metamemory is closely linked with a set of meta abilities, including the ability to gather information through real-time monitoring about the current state of the memory system. The metamemory concept has been closely linked with the theory of metacognition. Metacognition refers to a set of regulatory meta abilities and meta skills that are intentionally employed, aiming at the smooth operation of the cognitive and psychophysiological system as a means of gaining functional capability, self-efficacy, independent living, and life satisfaction. Metacognition engages consciousness-raising skills and strategies, including individuals' ability to monitor, regulate, and adapt their internal mental processes, recognize the difference between functional and dysfunctional states of mind, and consciously choose those states that awaken the full range of their abilities and identity. End quote. Both metamemory and metacognition are closely linked to one's own self-perception. One's meta ability to conceptualize their own thoughts, to even just make sense of the world, starts and ends at the body's self-structure, meaning that we need a body to properly relate to the world around us. We need to reflect on our own memories to form the self. But since those memories are disrupted due to dopamine, which is again prevalent in virtually every psychotic disorder, at least in some capacity, the self is thus disrupted. Furthermore, since we live in a memory in terms of real-time perception, it can be postured that because dopamine affects working memory, real-time memory, then dopamine is responsible for a real-time disruption of the self. I think the distinction between how we normally see memories and how I see memories is an important one. The extended self, a level above the minimal self, is formed through memories and the reflections we make upon them. This, in essence, develops our personality. But the minimal self isn't your personality. It's your mindness in the experiential reality and world. I think, therefore I am becomes I think externally, therefore I am not, within this minimal self model. So what gives then? If my theory is that meta-memory and metacognition are responsible when disrupted for self-disorder, but that memory only affects the extended self, then does my theory fall flat in its head? Well, not quite. This is where the distinction previously mentioned becomes vital. Memories are not just something to be reflected on retroactively. Rather, they are the field of awareness our brain creates while we process new information. To put it simply, our minds live inside of the memory. This puts memory as our past and our present. So while the extended self can become disrupted based solely on the past, the minimal self can become disturbed based solely on the present. And since meta-memory and metacognition are all about managing the processes of your brain's memory and dopamine can interfere with that, then it's safe to assume that dopamine can directly interfere with the self. This is why self-disorder can fluctuate, as different levels of the extended self past and the minimal self present can be disrupted at different points in time. This is the self-disorder spectrum dissociation. This would explain why self-disorder can be seen not just as a childhood disorder, which eventually leads to the onset of schizophrenia, but as a waning phenomenon that can both fluctuate and occur later in life. It's innately tied to memory, of which is the real-time perceptual self. Little voiceover note here, memory can be disturbed at different points in your life. So if you age and your brain starts to deteriorate, your self can then be disrupted because your memories become disrupted. Back to it though. Self-disorder then is a disruption not necessarily of the self, but of meta-memory and metacognition, of which are integral to the development of the self. This is due to a dopamine imbalance, which is again found in some capacity in all the psychotic type disorders I could think of. This solves our earlier problem and accounts for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, bipolar, schizophreniform, brief psychotic disorder, etc., etc. It also postures that self-disorder is indeed not a formative disorder necessarily, but can occur naturally as the brain ages and changes. Think of it this way. Just as schizophrenia exists on a spectrum, dissociation on the fundamental level may also do the same, which accounts for dementia and Parkinson's. This is because memories may be messed with at different levels of severity, and since memory distortion is, as we postured, probably the root cause of self-disorder, then self-disorder can occur at different levels of severity, even though they're all disruptions of the fundamental self. The embodied self then seems more complex than previously thought. This memory model lines up with the psychotic disorders discussed in this video, especially in regards to our main example of schizophrenia, where one of the core symptoms was the cognitive decline of memory. But what about drug-induced psychosis? Well, it's well documented that things like cannabis can induce dissociation on quite a primary and fundamental level. So I think it's safe to say that this can be included in the expanded consciousness model, especially when accounting for self-disorder's fluctuating nature. This, my friends, is the expanded consciousness model of psychosis. To conclude, we took a look at both the neuroscience behind it and the psychodynamics of how self-disorder accounts for many, if not most or even all, of the positive and even negative symptoms behind schizophrenia and psychosis as a whole. We accounted for the drawbacks of this theory and even found that depression and schizophrenia may be closely related. I think we've properly accounted for the very meaning of the word schizophrenia, a split mind. Psychosis is not a well-understood phenomenon, and the only thing I want to do with this section is open up a further discussion around self-disorder, which is criminally underanalyzed at the present moment. Now I'll let the professionals handle the rest, and presumably correct me on my primitive knowledge of neuroscience, as I essentially only had a couple days of research accounted for on the subject. And now I'm just realizing this was supposed to be a video on Hellblade. I guess we got a bit sidetracked along the way, huh? Now onto the game itself. To conclusively conclude our discussion in self-disorder, I'd like to take a look at the game, actually, and specifically the role of the player. The player is specifically referenced within the game on several occasions, even in the beginning of the game. The inner voices of Senua will directly speak to the player, which I believe is a manifestation of her self-disorder. This is backed up by lines like, "a stranger in your own body," and "I have died before." Unless I'm misremembering, I only have these lines written in my notes. Senua's self is fractured, and the metatext indicates she sees herself as something akin to our modern-day avatars or a video game character, as someone, you, are controlling her. Once again, I think I explained it best in my Milk 2 analysis when I said, as a child, I frequently imagined myself to be a video game character. When I say this, I mean it very literally. My perspective was often from a top-down third-person POV, identical to the bird's eye view you would find in any common RPG. This was not by choice, mind you. It would be accurate to say that I had no control over this. My body was little more than an avatar, and I would even wait to make movements until I could feel the analog controller make a certain input. Once I did, I would move with a calculated purpose, going only where I felt the player desired me to go. To this day, I'm unsure if my consciousness was the avatar or it was the player. Perhaps it was part of both. This phenomenon extended to the events in my life as well. Events that I would come to cast as a story. I wouldn't call it a predetermined fate, but rather that places were calling to me, aware that I specifically would someday go there. I was impressed and still am that they were able to pre-render those parts of the level, although I can't be sure if they actually did. Particularly eventful days were cataloged in my brain as VHS direct-to-television sequels to A Charlotte's Web. I created countless of them and would even imagine things like the commercial advertising the movie, with scenes of my life playing in a small square on the left side, while the right side had a VHS-esque yellow background with the tape slowly rotating proudly. It was always standing on its corner. When I look back at my childhood, this is what I see. I want to stress this as much as I can. I mean it quite literally. Most of my memories are perceived as happening outside of my body, as if my consciousness itself was a free-roaming camera on Golf with Your Friends. To this day, I wonder if I was real. If I am real, even now. End quote. This, to me, is how Senua experiences the world. And from personal experience, I can tell you it surely isn't fun. Carl Jung, who actually worked under Eugene Buehler, the man who coined the term schizophrenia, believes psychosis to be a defense mechanism against trauma, where the unconscious becomes much more prominent, sort of like a spiritual healing process. This aligns quite nicely with the expanded consciousness model, and accounts for the trauma aspect of disorders like schizophrenia, as dissociation is oftentimes part of the healing process. While self-disorder is also oftentimes something you are born with, it also makes sense when we account for the spectrum model that some form of psychiatric disturbance could arise from trauma in the formative age. This is an important and under-researched topic, and honestly, I don't have a clear-cut explanation for it. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, otherwise known as PMDD, was brought to my attention by a friend, and I'm glad she did, as this complicates the expanding conscious model even more, and I'm always here for some turbulence. PMDD within the psychotic lens is characterized by psychosis roughly around the time a person has their period, then seemingly full remission until the next cycle. Of course, they have a number of other symptoms, but those are for someone much more qualified to speak on. It's often said that reproductive health is mental health, and this, in this specific case, is due to estrogen's link to brain receptors, of which includes the topic of today's lengthy discussion, dopamine. So there are certainly some parallels, but I have to look more into it, which I did. There are also connections with PMDD and working memory, so we definitely have a basis still for this theory. Those with PMDD are said to have a much worse working memory around the time of their cyclical onset, and dissociation seems to be extremely common. I think what we are seeing is estrogen causing a disruption of dopamine, and that dopamine causing some form of satiety disturbance, albeit a lesser version as we have previously discussed. And since it seems that memory is mostly affected around the time of the period, and since memory manipulation is the key to self-disorder, well, that means one may experience psychosis on a cyclical basis, just as we discussed with schizophreniform and brief psychotic disorder. Alright, there. I think we got all the psychotic disorders out of the way. Seriously, there are way more than I thought. before going into this project. If you know one I didn't mention in this video, please comment down below and I'll try to make a follow-up. Or, better yet, feel free to make your own videos discussing it. I always love to see new YouTubers. Be sure to tag me in them or send your videos in the comments and I'll spotlight them. I suspect that the number of reported cases of psychotic disorders will be going up. This is due to partial and full consciousness transplantation, which I will be talking much more extensively about in what will probably be the next video on this channel discussing needy streamer overload. I also have a serial experiments lane video that'll be linked in the description that talks about this as well. Just not as much detail as I plan to go with the future video. This is a dire situation and one that needs fixing. However, I am not yet capable of saying what we concretely should do about psychosis. Instead, I will continue to study the issue, and I'll have to get back to you on that. It would be irresponsible of me to posture forth methods of how to treat psychotic symptoms, as I'm not a professional, and it is not lost to me the influence, no matter how small, I have on others. That's the nature of the job, after all. So, for now, we're gonna take a rain check on this one. The history of psychosis is vast, and is honestly what I find to be the most interesting aspect of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Like, the team clearly did their research on this one. Senua's condition, which is undeniably psychotic in nature, is categorized not as a mental illness as it should be, but rather as a curse by the gods, especially by her father. This, as one can assume, has a vast array of historical context behind it, as many religious civilizations thought that things like schizophrenia were spiritual in nature rather than psychiatric. And while this did kind of make sense for more primitive cultures, and is assumably still believed in parts of the world today, not everyone thought this. The Greeks and Egyptians specifically believed psychotic disorders to be rooted in things like the heart, and according to Hippocrates, the 4 bodily humors. And although their solutions were, well, less than ideal, it was at least a major step in the right direction. Antiquity in particular was a hard time for those with psychosis, as they were believed to be, like in Senua's case, punished by the gods, or simply having been possessed by evil demons. Medieval Europe, though, would be a step in the wrong direction, as while there is some belief that conditions such as schizophrenia are rooted in biological causes, such as diet or stress, institutions labeled as fool towers, better known as insane asylums now, became the norm for treatment. That and, graphic warning here, skip like 10 seconds to avoid it, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, or even more genius, release evil spirits. Ouch. Treatment gradually became better though. Philip Pinel, a Frenchman, was a pioneer in mental health care. While procedures before his time were described as inhumane and cruel, he advocated for a more personal approach, promoting moral therapy in 1798, which included things like decreasing stressful stimuli and establishing a relationship with patients based on trust and understanding. The term dementia praecox was vital in our understanding of schizophrenia specifically, and was coined by German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin. Also, we did connect in this video, a little voiceover note here again, schizophrenia and dementia, so there is some grounds for, it does kind of make sense, his basis. Finally, in 1900, Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Buehler coined the term schizophrenia, and our understanding accelerated. Although our treatments would remain pretty primitive until the 1950s, with the groundbreaking development of typical antipsychotics, and then further revolutionized in the 1990s with the advent of atypical antipsychotics. So finally, we are here today, with most of the world recognizing what schizophrenia and psychosis really is. That being said, there is still a lot of stigmatization. The very term psychotic is thrown around more than a football, and almost always used in a derogatory way, alluding to a violent or generally terrible person. My only hope is that this video, and thus this game, will help destigmatize the illness, increasing understanding, and furthering research into exactly how psychosis works. Gaming has never looked so real. While I consolidated and mean to keep this section short, I do briefly have to gush over Hellblade's more technical aspects. The graphics for the time are pretty revolutionary, and the second game, yes, this wonderful game has a sequel coming out, looks to be even more graphically enhanced. The way in which the game portrays Senua's detached from reality visually is also astounding. As for gameplay, the majority of the game you will be solving puzzles, those of which we'll dive deeper into in a later section of this video. The combat though is still prevalent, and honestly it's pretty fun, challenging as well at times. As for the music, it's also great, very atmospheric. Alright, now on to the important stuff. In some ways, I'm lucky. While my delusions are incredibly strong and unforgiving, my hallucinations are not too bad. I don't hear constant voices like seen in virtually every schizophrenia simulator that command me to do things, but rather I have an internal voice that I call the black text. It still commands me to do things like not take a medication, but it isn't an external auditory hallucination, so I suppose I can't complain too much. Most days I believe this to be an evil demon living inside of my head, a being that I constantly feel his presence in the room. But medication has helped with these symptoms. Senua, on the other hand, hears voices constantly. These voices can often help her and thus you in fights, which is very dangerous. To believe in the voices, the lies they tell you. Now, the game never portrays you in this aspect, which I kind of think it should, but it is still not good to trust so dependently in your inner voices. The puzzles in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice are perhaps one of the more interesting parts of the game and experience. They are a clear example of delusions of reference, as Senua sees patterns in ordinary, everyday things, and finds extreme personal significance in them. I do this, well, all the time, believing the radio is talking to me personally, or having to buy the most overpriced boba tea imaginable just because I thought it was my innate destiny to do so. That was a fun purchase. I can feel it. The darkness. It creeps into my mind more and more every day. I get scared. I think that my brain is diseased, that I wasn't born to be happy. And then I made a movie about it. Shameless plug, I'm working on a feature-length film, America Dreamin', so I hope you look forward to it. But in all seriousness, the rot or darkness is said to have a permadeath consequence, meaning if you die too many times, you will lose all your saved data and have to start the game over from scratch. Of course, spoiler alert, really the only big spoiler in the game, the permadeath situation is considered to be a hoax. No such thing will actually happen no matter how many times you die. So why include this besides the desire to add extra tension to each and every encounter? What is the narrative relevance? Well, it seems to me that the purpose of the darkness is because of Senua's father's abuse. He claims she was a rotting mess, that a darkness was slowly taking her over. The game backs this up as the darkness only spreads at certain checkpoints in the game itself, crescendoing into the ending as you experience her journey as she gets closer to Hela and confronts more of her trauma, especially with the Odin trials. Each and every time you die represents a mistake, and from personal experience I can surely say that each of those mistakes builds up. Every fallen step in the journey makes you falter, makes you consider unsavory outcomes and actions. It continues to fester and build until finally we arrive at Hela's altar. The darkness to me is the belief that your brain is diseased, that you are beyond saving. It's a frightful thought, and one that I've had countless times. It is the belief for Senua anyway, that she is the reason that Dillian died, because her darkness infected everyone. Of course, this is a byproduct of her father's abusive words. I don't really want to talk about the ending, for a variety of reasons. I am tired of script writing. I don't really want to spoil the game, and if I make this section short, the script will be 27 pages single-spaced, my lucky number. That's most of the reason why. But most of all, kind of, I want you to interpret the ending for yourself and leave your interpretation in the comments if you so desire. All I will say is, this epic tale comes to an end in the only way it possibly could. I'll leave it there. I think I used to be happy. Once. I used to feel things, maybe not as much as others, but I remember what joy felt like, even what sadness felt like. But now, there's nothing except despair, guilt over my own condition. When I'm with friends now, there is a permanent boredom, and not a regular type of being bored on a do-nothing day, but rather it's physically painful. It feels like life is like a cheese grater, and every day takes more and more of my soul off. It's waking up every day knowing what it will bring. That life will be boring and filled with despair every day after the next. And I know this is pessimistic, and I try to look towards the bright things, but there are less of them each and every progressive day. I think the hardest part of living with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia isn't the hallucinations or the delusions. They're the most dangerous, yes, but what strikes me down the most is this nothingness that is life. And I think you either resign yourself to it or go crazy trying to fight it. People can recover. You are more than an illness. I know that hope may very well exist, but I'm tired. I think Daniel, a YouTuber who was featured on the Special Books by Special Kids channel, said it best.
Do you believe you still possess the ability to be happy?
No.
I talked to a chocolate milk carton today, which is honestly kind of funny, but I had separated it from its fellow cartons. I could feel it trembling. I could feel its fear. Its screams of pain are still echoing in my head. And I do this every day, so many different times. My therapist tells me to let these thoughts slide off me like Vaseline, but I just can't shake them. Most people, I think, would call me crazy, even in this modern society we live in. But even if I don't believe it at times, I'm still human. I'm just human. There's only a couple pieces of advice I can give you in regards to psychosis. The first and certainly most important is that you have to take your medications. Believe me, I know it can be the most difficult thing on the planet sometimes, whether that be because of specific paranoid delusion you are experiencing, or believing you aren't sick and don't need it, or even just the nasty side effects like weight gain. And I know they won't make you feel necessarily better all the time in terms of mood, and it might even in some cases make your mood worse, but just remember this isn't just for you, for your loved ones, and for yourself, to stay safe. If there's one thing to take away from this video, ignore the science I explored and focus on this message. Take your meds. Secondly, be open about your mental illness. I know this world isn't quite accepting of it yet, but the only way to make that happen is to openly communicate what it is you're experiencing. I'm not saying you have to be some heroic advocate, but your friends and family deserve to know. In order to help you, they need to know. Now, a word from our sponsor, Squid Boy, my horror short film. Here is the trailer. God, I really miss saying this. And, as always, thank you for watching.